See all of you here today. It's my pleasure and my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Carolyn Heldman. For those of you who were here last year, then you know that you are in for a real fascinating talk. And for those of you who were not here last year, then you are in luck, because a version of the talk that she gave last year, which was entitled "The Sexy Lie, How Objectification Harms Women," is available on YouTube. It was a TED Talk. I looked at it today. There were over 1,085,000 hits on that talk. So I encourage you all to go and listen to or watch it after. Go home tonight and Google her. So it was really a challenge for me to try to summarize the life of someone who is as fascinating and multifaceted as Dr. Heldman. So I decided that I would do that based upon her suggestion, by the way, of choosing just 5 words. 5 words to try to describe her, which wasn't easy, as you can probably imagine. So I looked at the theme of this year's conference, what is success, and I tried to come up with 5 words or phrases that I think answer that question by looking at her life and the work that she does. And so the first word that I chose is scholar. Dr. Heldman holds 3 degrees. She has a BA in Business Administration from Washington State University. She holds 2 political science degrees, a master's and a PhD from Rutgers. She is currently the chair of the Department of Politics at Occidental College. She specializes in the American presidency and systems of power. She focuses on issues related to gender, to race, and the media. She teaches, among other classes called the American Presidency, Gender and Politics, and Mass Media and American Politics. The following are just but a few. If I were here to stand here and read all of her articles and presentations and books, you would never get a chance to hear from her. So I chose just 3 that kind of reflect the important work that she's doing in those areas. She's co-authored a book entitled "Rethinking Madam President, Are We Ready for a Woman in the White House?" Friends with Benefits, Without the Friendship Maybe, First-Year College Students Confront Hookup Culture, and Sexualizing Sarah Palin, The Social and Political Context of the Sexual Objectification of Female Candidates. So one part of Carolyn's life that I find particularly admirable is that she's able to bridge the gap between that scholarly work that I just described to you and make it accessible and applicable to the lives of people outside of her discipline and outside of her profession. And so the second word I'm going to choose is activism. Hers is a strong and powerful voice that often speaks for women whose voices are not yet strong enough to speak on their own. Dr. Heldman is a national leader in the campus anti-rape movement, and I hope that some of you were able to listen to her talk on behalf of the Andrews Center here in Boise last June on that topic, because if you did, then you would understand why I've chosen that word, activism. She's a national leader in that movement. She co-founded 3 organizations devoted to the issue: the Oxy Sexual Assault Coalition, End Rape on Campus, and Faculty Against Rape. In addition, in an act that I find particularly admirable and courageous, she's a plaintiff in a Title 7, because I'm so used to that, Title 9 case against Occidental College to challenge Occidental's approach and response to sexual assault on their campus. She's also been deeply involved in helping to rebuild New Orleans after the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. She is a leader in Common Ground, a New Orleans-based grassroots organization, and she co-founded Critical Response, which provides volunteers to engage in high-risk rescue efforts during crises and disasters. She runs a blog. She has an active Twitter feed. Last year after this conference, I ran home and I Googled her, and now I follow her on Twitter, and I'm a friend of hers on Facebook, and I encourage you all to do the same, because you learn a lot about the issues that she is involved in. She has made over 500 appearances as a political and social commentator. She's a frequent contributor to news organizations such as MSNBC, Fox News, CNBC, and the Huffington Post. My third word is accomplished. So in addition to what I just said, which is just a snippet of the work that she does in those areas, personally, she has a 4th degree black belt in Taekwondo. She's an accomplished vocalist, and her performance range from opera to heavy metal. She suggested the other night that she's the lead in 3 different bands, so she is literally and figuratively a rock star. My 4th word is woman. So Carolyn Heldman is a woman who is an accomplished scholar. She's a woman who is an accomplished activist, And that leads me to my fifth choice, which is really hard to do. I could have chosen to take from Admiral Howe yesterday. I could have chosen pioneer. I could have chosen leader of the quilting bee. I could have chosen teacher. I could have chosen Shiro from Justice O'Connor. And instead, I'm going to choose a word that we've heard over and over in this conference, and that is role model. So I'm 52 years old. I'm much older than she is. She is clearly one of my role models, which is indicative of you're never too young to be a role model, and you're never too old to find one. But surely she is the role model of many of you in this room, and if she's not now, she will be in about 45 minutes. She's surely a role model of her students at Occidental, and I think that she's a role model for many, many women across this country. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Dr. Karen Heldman. And now I'm just nervous after that introduction. Thank you, Susan. And thank you to Dr. David Adler and to Kathy Scott for really making all of this happen. Today, I want to talk about the imposter syndrome. I know the title of the talk in your booklet is the imposter syndrome, but I'm actually going to have a positive focus, if you can believe that. So if you do follow my work, you know I'm a great believer in realistic pessimism. But we're going to talk a little bit about how to overcome that today. So I want to start off, for folks who have writing utensils, don't worry, this is not a test. You will not be sharing this with anyone. Exactly. If you have a writing utensil, write down your top 5 achievements. What do you take most pride in? Your degrees, your awards, your accomplishments. Your top 5. And if you don't have something to write with, tick it off in your head. I'm sure it won't be difficult, right? This is a room full of women who are in various stages of leadership. Georgia's looking at me very knowingly. She has her 5. Excellent. Okay, hold on to those. Sit tight. I'm going to share with you my top 5. Thankfully, Susan has gone through a lot of that already, or my top 5 is in that list, so I'll just be very quick here. The PhD is definitely the top 5. Lots of pain and agony to achieve that. I would also, for similar reasons, put up the black belt. My publications, number 4 would be my work in the media, and number 5 would be co-founding 4 nonprofit organizations that are doing rather well. So those are my top 5 accomplishments. In addition to that, I want to be the first to tell you today that I am a fraud, or at least I feel like a fraud all the time. And I don't want you to raise your hand, but I know a lot of you in this room join me in that. What is the imposter syndrome? And I'm the poster child for the imposter syndrome. The imposter syndrome is a psychological phenomenon where people are, basically the short way of saying it is that people are unable to internalize their own accomplishments, right? They're simply unable to internalize them. So despite a lot of external evidence that you have achieved a lot, you convince yourself that you are a fraud and you don't deserve the success that you've achieved. And proof of success, when you see your resume or your CV, you will often dismiss it as luck, timing, the results of deceiving others into thinking you're more intelligent or more competent than you believe yourself to be. And I know that many of you know what I'm talking about, right? You walk into classrooms, you walk into boardrooms, you walk into offices, and you feel like frauds. You feel like you have tricked your teachers, your professors, your bosses, your coworkers into thinking you are more smart and more competent than you are. It's this idea, right, that many of us are presenting a false self, projecting a public sense of presumed competence and command that really masks a lot of insecurities. And I haven't met many women who don't suffer from this at various points in their career, and I'll get to that in a moment. But just to make this real, I want to provide 2 examples. One is my dear friend, Karen Krause, who is a decorated New York Times sports writer. She has a job that my students envy. They tell me that all the time. Karen goes one day to the next. You like how this personal exposition. One day to the next, thinking this will be the day
when I go into a press conference and I will ask the question that makes me look like a fool and everyone will know. My secret will be out. This is someone who is at the pinnacle of her career, who is fearful that tomorrow will be the day they find out that she's a fraud. Another of my colleagues, a former student, who is an African-American woman who graduated at the top of her class, undergraduate, who got a full ride and then some to UCLA to get her PhD. She described it as visually thinking throughout her educational experience that a big hand was going to come in and reach down and pull her up and say, "You do not belong here." She was in fear of that and apparently continues to be in fear of that even as she moves into the professional realm. So visually, this is what the imposter syndrome looks like, right? You have what you think you know, which is a very small amount in your head, and then what other people think you know, which is the much larger circle, when in reality, you know a lot more than people know that you know, right? You know a lot. People know a little bit of what you know, but they don't know the whole story. So now that we know what the imposter syndrome is, and I know some of you have heard this term before, for many of you, though, this is new because I have been asked yesterday and today by many people, what is the imposter syndrome? It's a term you're unfamiliar with, but not probably unfamiliar with in terms of experience, just unfamiliar with in terms of label. So today I want to do 5 things. I want to talk about who suffers from the imposter syndrome, because not everyone in this room does suffer from the imposter syndrome. I want to administer a really quick quiz to see whether or not you suffer from the imposter syndrome. I want to talk about why it matters, the big so what, which every talk hopefully should have. I want to analyze the origins of the imposter syndrome and then provide some very concrete ways for overcoming the imposter syndrome. And overcoming it's rather easy. Changing our culture so that we don't experience it is the big challenge in front of us. So what I'm going to do is vacillate between larger, sometimes theoretical and esoteric critiques of what I think is happening in our broader culture that is causing this at the individual level, and then going to the individual level and talking about how it affects your lives. So again, I'll be going in and out from the 30,000 view down to the ground and back up again. So, who suffers from it? The imposter syndrome was first identified in 1978 by 2 psychologists, and they found, in looking at the demographics of this syndrome, that women are disproportionately likely to experience it, but a specific type of woman, a successful woman, a woman who has achieved worldly success in our culture. I'm pretty sure that I am standing in front of a group of about 500 women who fit this category. So the odds of you having the imposter syndrome are higher than the average population. But just to put some numbers on this, 2 in 5 successful women think they're frauds. So 2 in 5 women in American culture suffer the imposter syndrome on an ongoing basis, on a debilitating basis. 70% of women have experienced it at some point in their life. And women of color and women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are much more likely than white women or women who come from privilege to experience this. What does this data mean? It doesn't mean that if you're a man you can't suffer from the imposter syndrome. It just means statistically you're more likely to suffer it if you're a woman. It doesn't mean that if you're a woman of privilege, socioeconomic privilege, that you won't suffer from the imposter syndrome. It just means you're less likely to, right? And it doesn't mean that if you're a white woman you're not going to suffer from the imposter syndrome. It just means that women of color are more likely to experience this syndrome. And I can speak from personal experience about the lower socioeconomic status. I grew up in the small town of Yakult, Washington. No, you haven't heard of it. No, it is not Yakima. It's a town of 500. Actually, I think we might be up around 1,000 now. Growing up, my father was a janitor. My mother was a homemaker. We were a family of 8, 6 kids, 2 adults living on $18,000 a year. What does that translate into? It translates into abject poverty. It translates into being hungry almost every day of my life growing up. When our electricity was cut off, I would pile my clothing on top of myself. I learned how to do this as a toddler, right? I piled clothing on top of myself so that I could keep warm. I went to school dirty. I went to school without new clothing. What this means is my entire life, I was from being a very small child, and the poor kids in this room, much love to you, you know what I'm talking about. You never get over that. And I don't know if maybe you had an experience in your childhood or you've had a series of experiences now, but this is how your experiences imprint upon you. So, how did this translate into what happened in my professional life? I graduated really early, but I always thought that, well, yeah, I'm smart, but I don't really have the skills that everybody thinks I have, right? I convinced myself that somehow my graduate program had made a mistake in accepting me, that my dissertation committee was just being nice when they passed me, even though it was an incredibly difficult experience, right? I convinced myself that I was hired for very competitive jobs because I had good public speaking skills, and that most of my publications really don't matter because they're co-authored, right? I'm a collaborator. I like to work with other people. So all ways to take my success and define it as something other than success. So I suffered from the imposter syndrome for many, many years, right? Convincing myself that somehow all of this had happened by fate, not by something I had done. And I think that that's something that those of us who suffer the imposter syndrome do really, really well, right? It's the only thing we think we do well, actually, is bamboozle a whole lot of people, right? I mean, how many people do we have to trick for this to even really hold water in our lives? So, let's find out if you suffer from the imposter syndrome. I have 8 questions. They're yes/no questions. So what I would like you to do is, and you don't have to, no one's going to know the answer, don't worry, because people with the imposter syndrome are really oftentimes afraid of people seeing their true selves. If you answer yes to any of these questions, you have it at least somewhat. If you answer yes to all 8 questions, then I would consider that you look up the imposter syndrome. There are a number of good books on it. First, do you secretly worry that others will find out you're not as bright or capable as they think you are? Do you sometimes shy away from challenges because of nagging self-doubt? And we've heard a number of people talking about how to overcome that, which means that we all kind of accept that as a problem in many of our lives. Number 3, do you tend to chalk your accomplishments up to being a fluke, no big deal, the fact that people just like you? Number 4, do you hate making a mistake or being less than fully prepared or not doing things perfectly? Number 5, do you tend to feel crushed by even constructive criticism, seeing it as evidence of your ineptness? And I'm brought back to what the Admiral said in our open, wonderful speech, right, where she talked about not burning down your wagon. When do many of us burn down our wagon? When we get criticism that we simply cannot handle. And so we burn down our wagon and we walk away from it. Number 6, when you do succeed, do you think, woo, I got away with it again this time? Number 7, do you believe that other people are smarter and more capable than you, other people in your similar positions? And number 8, do you live in fear of being unmasked, discovered, found out? If you are the rare woman who does not suffer from the imposter syndrome, this talk still applies to you because you are surrounded by men and women who do. So you can help them. So, why does this matter? Let's get to the so what. Well, this is why it matters. Because we have a very well-documented confidence gap, which is a direct result of the imposter syndrome. And these are all gendered, by the way. When I'm talking about gaps, I'm talking about gender gaps. We have a gender gap when it comes to confidence. We have a gender gap when it comes to ambition that is linked to the confidence gap. And all of this leads to substandard, subpar, undemocratic, non-diverse leadership at the top levels in the corporate world and in the political world. And I'll go into all 3 of these in greater detail. So, starting with the confidence gap, what do we know? Well, we know that confidence is the magic that turns things into action, right? So the natural result of low confidence is inaction, right? So when we lack confidence, we are less likely to act. What we do know from study after study is that when women lack the confidence but are forced to act, they perform just as well as men do. This is well demonstrated in the data. We also know, for example, that men overestimate their abilities and performance, and women routinely underestimate theirs. So it's not just an issue of women underestimating our abilities, it's also an issue that men overestimate their abilities, and overestimation is not a negative thing. You might think in some instances, certainly in interpersonal instances, you might experience it negatively. You may also know it by one of its symptoms called mansplaining, but it actually helps you out quite a bit. If you overestimate your abilities, you will actually perform better than you otherwise would. We also know that men, this confidence gap, causes men to apply for jobs when they meet 60% of the criteria. Women wait until they meet 100%. This is a fascinating study because it came out of Hewlett-Packard. A few years ago, they wanted to know why it was that so few women were moving into leadership positions. And so they ran some studies, they ran focus groups, they ran some experiments, and they found out that it's because women will not apply for positions unless they think they are absolutely qualified for those positions. Again, the confidence gap leading to ultimately to a leadership gap. Men also negotiate more often, and when they do, they're more successful at negotiating. This has been linked to different confidence levels, and it starts really early on, right? Even in business school, at the Harvard Business School, the Davidson study that came out a few years ago found that male business students actually think that they deserve more money than female students, even though female students have higher GPAs. They're academically outperforming the men, but they believe that they deserve less. So how does this translate? How does the confidence gap feel when we're in the workforce? Well, we generally don't answer questions unless we're totally sure of the answer. And this comes up in a college classroom, so the educators here know what I'm talking about, actually not college, in the classroom setting, where girls are playing these tapes about whether or not what they're saying is right and they want to be pleasing to others. Boys and men generally are not playing those tapes, right? We don't like to submit a report unless we've edited it ad nauseum. We obsess about perfection. In fact, Bob Sullivan and Hugh Thompson wrote a book called The Plateau Effect, where they talked about how, and it's a very gendered thing, how women who, especially women who suffer the imposter syndrome, have a tendency toward what they call the enemy of the good, which is a focus on perfection that leads to hours of wasted time. So the irony is that striving to be perfect often keeps us from getting as much as we should get done. So, the confidence gap, which has been well documented, is directly related to the imposter syndrome. It's actually sort of, in some sense, another way of saying the imposter syndrome. This translates into a pretty large ambition gap in both the political and the corporate sector. And I'll just share a few studies. There's a large literature on this. College men, not everyone thinks about running for public office, but of those who do, about half the population, college men are twice as likely than their female counterparts to think about running for public office. Twice as likely. Men and women place the exact same value now. This is a new thing, but in the last 5 years, men and women are placing the same value on having a successful career, regardless of what sector it is in. But women are not rewarded for their ambition through promotions and pay, and therefore end up not being as ambitious when they get into the workforce. What does this translate into? A sharp leadership gap in both the corporate and the political sector. Just looking at the corporate sector, we have had a rather large shift in CEOs in recent years. It jumped from female CEOs, I should say. It jumped from 3% to 4%. Women are 51% of the population, and we celebrated when we achieved 4% of the CEOships in the country. Obviously, the pyramid at the bottom is much larger. We comprise about half of the workforce, about half of the managerial, professional, and related occupations. So we comprise a larger amount of kind of middle management than men do at this point, owing to the fact that women are getting more advanced degrees. That can be directly correlated with that. But you see the sharp decline, right, from 51.5%. So really, if this pyramid were proportional, the first two would be like this, and then it would just be like a little sliver sticking up in the middle, right? Because then we see this huge drop-off when it comes to management. There are many, many reasons for it, but some of the primary reasons are the confidence gap and the ambition gap. And I think it's important to keep in mind, because we dupe ourselves. Every 10 years or so I have to remind myself, progress is not linear. When you are pushing up against a system as old as patriarchy and as persistent as sexism, it will not concede anything easily. Why doesn't it concede? And it's not men sitting in a dark room, right, twiddling their fingers like an episode of The Simpsons. Anytime you have a system that is so ingrained, like sexism, so acceptable, so ubiquitous, it actually means that men and women are upholding the system. And we uphold it through a lot of internalized values, right? But it's important to keep in mind that when you push against these systems, the small number of people who are pushing against them, the system will push back. It's called a backlash. Susan Faludi wrote about it in 1992. I assign that text sometimes blow off the dust and assign it to my students, and it's news to them, right? They think progress is linear. It's not. In fact, when you look at what is happening in the corporate sector, we've only had a 2% increase. 2% increase in 15 years. Board positions flat for 7 years. Corporate officer positions flat for 4 years, right? And a lot of people say, well, no, it's just the pipeline. That's an argument you've heard. There just aren't enough women in the pipeline. That, my friends, is simply untrue. Women have been outpacing men in degrees since 1982, and they comprise half the workforce. It is not a lack of bodies. It is a number of other factors which we are getting into. The leadership gap is also persistent when it comes to politics. And one of the speakers talked yesterday about how once you get up to the 17% point, whether it's female protagonists, women in the media industry, women in politics, women in high-level corporate positions, men and women alike think that there's diversity. 17% seems to be some magical cutoff point, right? We, again, are 51% of the population, or 50.8% of the population. So we are stymied, stuck at 17. In the House and the Senate, it's looked similar for many years. At the governor level, it's about 1 out of 10 governors of major states across the country are female. About 1 out of 10 major city mayors are female. At the statewide elected level and the state ledge, those numbers have actually gone down in the past 10 years. They've gone down. So it's not just an issue of plateauing, it's an issue of losing ground. So I want to jump to the next big topic, which is why is this syndrome gendered? I think answering this question actually gets us to why the syndrome exists in the first place. And when I looked at the literature on this and I looked at what a lot of business scholars were saying, I felt that there was something major missing that social scientists could jump in and help with. Because this comes from a larger society, right? We live in a society where a number of structural mechanisms are in place that encourage the imposter syndrome. In fact, given the messages that girls and women receive, I would be shocked if the imposter syndrome did not exist. It would be strange if it did not exist, given the things that we have in our culture to both convey it, teach it to very young girls, who then grow into women, and to reinforce it once you get into the workplace. So I want to focus on societal attitudes, really bad feedback that we get in the workforce, biased actions which reinforce this bad, faulty feedback, and then get into more of the meta or theoretical, looking at ideas about knowledge, and then what I call the great setup, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute. So when it comes to societal attitudes, there is a lack of support, right? A lack of support from family, friends, coworkers, even sometimes mentors, teachers, people you look up to that support this idea that women are not supposed to be ambitious, right? Promoting the idea that women are not supposed to be ambitious. You heard one of the speakers talk about when she was trying, it was Dr. Ochoa trying to figure out what she was going to major in, and her professor pulls out the little blocks and says, you're going to have to touch one of these, this sort of kind of ridiculous effort to, and it's done in a patronizing way, right? I'm just helping you out. Because, girls don't like blocks and they don't like physics. This sort of patronizing, I'm just trying to make sure that you're comfortable. That translates into a strong lack of support for girls and women going into STEM, for girls and women going into leadership. This is especially the case in stereotypical domains. And we have found in study after study, and I'm citing one from Sherry Carrera from 2006, where girls and boys rate men as being more competent in tasks that are associated with men. So we're talking about STEM, we're talking about math and science, but we're also talking about leadership. Boys are rated as more competent by both boys and girls who have the exact same skill level. Also, people expect women to act modestly, even if they are highly accomplished, right? I don't know if any of you have had an uncomfortable reaction to some of the long resumes of the women who've been read. You may have had a strong reaction to me owning my 5 biggest achievements. If you had that reaction, you know, I kind of celebrate that now, but I found myself earlier in my life where I was like, why is she, you know, what a big ego. Why is she doing that? That's a very, very gendered phenomenon, right? When we don't put our resume out, people tend to not know it, and then they tend to not reward us as much. So societal attitudes reinforce the imposter syndrome. But also, we get really bad feedback. We are not treated the same in the workforce. We're simply not treated the same. So let's go through some of the more recent studies. And I just pulled studies from the past 5 years, and we have about 40 years of research on this subject. Not everybody, let's start with the first bullet point, not everybody prefers, has a gender preference for their boss, but of those who do, which is about half of the American population, 2 to 1, men are preferred. So there is still a male bias, a preference for male bosses. And what is so sad about this statistic is that it doesn't vary by the gender of the employee. Men and women both prefer men 2 to 1. Men are still seen as the default leaders in the U.S. and Europe, and Catalyst has put out some excellent research. And it's interesting when you look across cultures, it doesn't matter what the leadership style is. If it's affiliated with men, then it will be more valued in that particular country. When it comes to CEOs and evaluating male and female CEOs, a number of experiments have been run with CEOs, male and female CEOs speaking the same amount, and we actually see female CEOs, we consider them to be less competent, and we consider them less suited to leadership when they talk the same amount as male CEOs. But here's the scary part that I didn't put on the slide. We actually view the competence of female CEOs as being higher when they speak less. Just let that sink in for a moment. These sort of systemic factors promote the imposter syndrome. Also, again, in the vein that progress is not linear, male college students are more likely to evaluate female leaders as submissive than a decade ago, which means that no, we are not actually improving when it comes to societal attitudes, which then translate into how the workforce plays out. Also, Catalyst found in 2007 in a wonderful study that women leaders are perceived as either competent or they're liked, but they are rarely both, which speaks volumes about the double bind of women's leadership, where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You're damned if you do. So in order to be conceived of as a competent leader, you have to present as masculine. So if you present as if you present as masculine but you're a woman, then you are damned, right? Damned if you do, damned if you don't. You have to present as masculine in order to be seen as a legitimate leader, and then you're taken apart for presenting as masculine. I know that many of you in the armed forces experience this, many of you in leadership experience a double bind of women's leadership, and it really is a double bind. There isn't a good way out of it. You have to take it situation by situation to negotiate that. And lastly, I want to focus on female employees receiving harsher evaluations. This is a new line of research. There have only been a few studies. I want to talk about one. And the long and short of it is that women are actually evaluated more negatively, both in terms of the amount of negative content and the actual content itself. And I will argue that faulty feedback, when we don't get good, meritorious feedback in something as basic as annual evaluations, then it leads to faulty reasoning, i.e. the imposter syndrome. So let's look at one of these studies. Kieran Snyder from Fortune just conducted a study that she published in Fortune.com 1 month ago. She conducted a content analysis of 248 reviews from 180 people in 2014, randomly selected from, and this is the corporate sector, and she found very stark differences in both the tone and the content of feedback that male and female employees receive. And these are different types of evaluations, but you can see that the pattern is the same. So in the reviews, 58.9% of the male reviews were critical compared to almost 90% of the reviews that women received. And also she found in her content analysis that men receive very constructive criticism. Women receive less constructive criticism, and the most common theme for women, the negative evaluation, is that they're told to pipe down. And she gave some concrete examples of this in one evaluation, luckily from the same manager. So there's some consistency in terms of who is doling out the feedback. He wrote to a man, quote, "Take the time to slow down and listen. You would achieve even more." And to his female employee, he wrote, you can come across as abrasive sometimes. I know you don't mean to, but you need to pay more attention to your tone. And just to add another little layer of realism here, it doesn't vary by the sex of the boss. Again, when you have such a persistent pattern, it's upheld by both men and women in the workplace. Beyond evaluations, beyond societal ideas, we also have really biased feedback, as in, this is the proof, right? This is what it translates into. We know from study after study, the most recent one that I found was Linus and Heldman in 2006, female managers are held to a higher standard than male managers for promotion. Similar findings for pay. What does this mean? It means we should really be challenging this idea of merit, right? As someone who studies democratic theory, I am bothered with underrepresentation, but I'm really bothered with merit. We're supposed to live in a meritorious society, right? But we accept non-meritorious promotions all the time. When this sort of bias exists, it means that we are not operating within a merit-based system. We also know that women actually use similar strategies to men in order to get ahead, but they advance at a much slower pace. Men are twice as likely to be hired for jobs involving mathematics for women, despite having the exact same skills. We know this from an experiment where identical applicants applied for jobs, all they did was switch the names. And the rate of hireability went down dramatically for women. We also know that science faculty favor male students over female students. This is another really interesting experiment where half the scientists in the sample, randomly selected from across the United States, a representative sample, half the scientists were given an application, exact same application with a man's name on it, and the other half a woman's name on it. They found that the female applicants were rated significantly lower than the males in terms of competence, hireability, and whether the scientists would mentor the student. So we see very clear evidence that it's not just an issue of attitudes, it's also an issue of action. So it is not surprising that men in the workforce, regardless of the domain, men at all levels of their career report higher job satisfaction than women at all levels, all levels. Okay, I want to shift gears here, and I only have maybe about 10 minutes left to talk, and I want to open it up to questions, make sure there's plenty of time for that. But I want to shift gears and talk about children for a moment. And I have a riddle for you, and you may have heard this riddle before. You may figure it out rather quickly. Most of the time people don't, so I will say it twice. But what I ask of you is that you not tell your neighbor, and you don't blurt out the answer, and you're honest when I ask you whether or not you figured it out. Okay, so no blurting out. Okay, here's the riddle. A father and his son, this is an Idaho-based riddle, they go hunting in the woods, and there's a terrible accident, and the father shoots his son accidentally. They jump in a car, they run to the emergency room, the boy is prepped, brought into surgery in order to remove the bullet. And the surgeon looks at the boy and says, I cannot operate it on this child, he's my son. How can that be? Don't say it. How many of you know? Okay, it's about half of you. I'm going to say it one more time, which is really happy. That makes me so happy. My students never get this the first time. Okay, so father and son hunting in Idaho. What's a good hunting location? Stanley. Father accidentally shoots his son in the leg. They jump in the car. They go in. He's prepped for surgery. The surgeon comes in, looks at the child and says, I cannot operate on this boy. He's my son. How many of you got it this time? Okay, so about 2/3. All right, what's the answer? The surgeon is the mom, right? So we're at a women's leadership conference, right? We're at a women's leadership conference. I have primed you, I have prepped you to think about women, right? As experts, as knowledgeable people. But what's at the heart of the imposter syndrome, and this is where it gets tough, and this is where it gets really theoretical too. The heart of the imposter syndrome is the idea that women are not legitimate possessors of knowledge. I think that's the bottom line. We are not considered to be legitimate possessors of knowledge in this society, and this is the first provocative statement I'm going to make and back up. This deeply held societal notion is really evident, by the way, in stock Google images, because I wanted to find a fantastic image of women, right, and knowledge, and we're going to put it all together. And after about 10 minutes of looking, I gave up, right? The idea that knowledge is synonymous with being male in our culture is so ingrained that I couldn't find a Google image that worked. But this is the first 6 or 7 Google images. This is what I found. We think of the ideal citizen, right? When you think of someone who's intelligent, who we think of as a culture as intelligent, you're most likely to conjure up the image of a white man in a white lab coat, right? His whiteness and his maleness are not random. This idea we have in our minds about who is a legitimate possessor of knowledge. They are ingrained ideas about what we consider to be knowledge, right, which is scientific and objective, which Judith Butler has a lot to say about, which I won't get into today, and also who we consider to be possessors of knowledge. I am sure many of you could tell war stories about your denial of expert status. My guess is that you face it almost every day. I face it every day. I used to look like a normal person with regular colored hair. I like to tell very young children that my hair is naturally pink and I blonde it. I tried for years to look like a legitimate possessor of knowledge, and you know what I figured out? I actually can't do it. I actually can't do it. So I give up. I get my hair dyed pink. It doesn't matter what domain you're in either, and I notice this because I'm in a lot of diverse domains with lots of different people, with different educational levels, and lots of diversity in these different groups. It didn't matter. In the academic domain, in the world of music, martial arts, and activism, every domain, I face a constant denial of expert status, as many of you do. Most of the time, you're probably not given the time of day if someone doesn't know your credentials, and God forbid they find out what your credentials are, because then you have to prove yourself, right? It's an exhausting process. I don't do it anymore. I don't care what you think of me. It's a great litmus test. You think I'm dumb? Perfect. Moving on. Thank you. This system, like other systems, right, is ingrained in both men and women. I don't think women think of other women as legitimate possessors of knowledge either. I'll say I struggle, right? Any system that is embedded in you as a child, whether it's racism, whether it's sexism, whether it's heterosexual, whatever it is, you can never be cured of it, right? You can never reach it. You can only be on the path and constantly be struggling to stop those thoughts or let them come in and not let them affect you. And so I will tell you from personal experience that I go out of my way to think of my female students as possessors of knowledge. And the fact that I have to consciously think about that means that it is so ingrained in me, someone who has studied this and fought against it for so long, that most of the time it's just a part of our life. We don't think about it. But I want you to think about that if you would like. I don't actually want to tell you to do anything, but it'd be good if you thought about it. So we are not legitimate possessors of knowledge. So what are we? What are we taught to be? And this does tie into the sexy lie. I won't talk about it too much. So girls and women are supposed to be decorative, right? This is our primary value. It doesn't mean we can't be other things. It just means that this is the primary way in which we are evaluated. It's the primary way in which we evaluate other women. It's the primary way in which we are evaluated by men. And of course, men get to be the great validators, right? They get to be the great validators of both men and women. Men are not concerned so much about what women think, they're more concerned about what other men think. We know this from lots of great masculinity studies. And you can see, I love these images, right? Easy to find, where you have stark differences. Men are encouraged to use, or boys are encouraged to use their brains, and girls are encouraged to use their body. So now I want to get really out there in terms of theory, and I want to talk about something I call the great setup, or the great masculine setup. Because the idea that women can't be legitimate possessors of knowledge, which is at the heart of the imposter syndrome, is actually part of a larger societal issue where women are seen as less than by both men and women. We are seen as second-class citizens by both men and women. It's something we don't acknowledge, it's something we don't talk about, but it is so obvious, it is plain as the nose on our faces. This is compounded, of course, by socioeconomic status, by sexuality, by race, by ability, right? That your stature as a citizen in terms of who is considered legitimate in our culture goes down as you add layers of intersectionality. So, what is the great setup? The great setup is a pretty straightforward idea. Masculinity is not organic. Masculinity doesn't just spring out of the earth. It doesn't come from hormones. It doesn't come from physicality. Masculinity and femininity vary widely over time, and they vary widely from culture to culture. So how do we create and craft our masculinity? Well, we're in a particularly toxic stage of masculinity. The past 2 decades have given us a type of masculinity where boys are taught what it means to be a man by rejecting everything that is feminine. Just want to state that a few times. How do we know this? Anything remotely associated with femaleness is rejected, right? Anything that is pink, even though 100 years ago that would have been masculine. Anything that is ornate, dolls, right? We call them toy soldiers instead when boys play with them. Long hair, emotional displays, except for the most common one, also known as violence, which we don't classify as an emotion because that would be inconsistent with allowing boys and men to display that. The prevalence of the rejection of the feminine in developing masculinity is so pervasive and normalized that it's invisible. And women continue to be the primary caretakers of children in our culture. So once again, we see men and women promoting the idea that in order to be a real boy who grows into a real man, you have to reject everything that is feminine. Masculinity is reactionary. It does not exist without femininity. So, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. I raised my nephew for 6 years from the ages of 6 to 12, and for those of you who have children, these are really crucial years for policing masculinity. I went to my first night, I get a 6-year-old, I'm ready, we go to, a reading night at his school. And within the first hour, I heard the phrase, boys don't cry, twice in the span of that hour. And it elicited laughter. And it really shocked me because as someone who's studying this, you feel it certainly in different ways, but having watched this policing go on and having the parents participate in it was an eye-opener. My eyes were further opened when his female crocheting teacher, who had an MA in education, told me that her boyfriend encouraged her to kick my nephew out of her crocheting class because it would, quote, turn him into a girl. To illustrate the absurdity of this point, of course, I responded, oh, no, it's fine if he turns into a girl, that's cool. So throughout the 6 years he spent with me, I battled administrators, I battled his peers, media, other parents, so that he could develop an identity that wasn't based upon rejecting everything that girls are supposed to do. Of course, I was fighting a losing battle. It had already been implanted well before, 6 years old. It starts really from the womb. And boys and men cannot possibly form their identity based on outright rejection and disdain of all that is feminine, and then be expected to truly consider girls and women to be full citizens. That's what's wrong with this. So how does this play out at the adult level? I just want to briefly share, I know that I want to get to some questions. Male students in my class, I run focus groups, and I tell male students, I know about this setup. I know that you actually, when you're thinking about if you're heterosexual, you're thinking about who you're going to date, you're actually thinking about what other men will think of her, less, that's a big consideration, male validation. And when you interact with women, right, that you always think of them as lesser than, because it's been ingrained in your social DNA, and they always are shocked, like, have you been following me around in my mind with a secret camera? And of course I tell them I have, so that they tell the truth. But one of my students in a focus group said, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, because I sit in classes with women who, girls is the term that he used, where they're smarter than me and they're working harder than I am in my college classes. But I always think in the back of my mind, yeah, it doesn't matter. I'm a man. And those are the tapes that a lot of men are encouraged to play. Now, my new research direction is really focusing on what it does to boys and men to be asked, to have your core identity involve dehumanizing women. It comes at a great personal toll, but that is actually a different talk. So, I think the imposter syndrome, to bring it back, and then we'll talk about some actions we can take, it's really a struggle to see ourselves as anything other than an imposter when we're told that we're lesser than, and that our value lies in being decorative. And I love this short statement, right, that it reveals a fundamental incompatibility with being female and successful in a society where we're not full humans, where our full humanity is denied. And again, I want to point out, that's an intersectional experience. As a white woman, I know the many ways in which I am privileged, and as an able-bodied woman, I know the many ways in which I'm privileged, and we need to keep that in mind, that anything that you think you may be experiencing, others are likely experiencing it much worse than you. So, what can we do to overcome this? Thankfully, the answer is plenty. So, this is what psychologists have found. At the individual level, the best therapy for overcoming the imposter syndrome is to recognize it. We're done. Actually, once you recognize it, it ceases to hold its purchase on you, by and large. It'll creep back in. I use the analogy of the nasty winter cold. It'll creep back in, but by and large, it will disappear once you recognize it, you interrogate it, and you reject it. But you can also immunize yourself against this imposter syndrome. So again, it doesn't affect you like a seasonal flu, right? You can give yourself a shot, or so, and not in figurative terms. Please don't anyone give yourselves a shot. I want to just give you five things to do. I know everybody's giving advice. So here's the part, you write it out, right? Concrete things to do. Stop seeking outside validation. Stop seeking it. It will come to you. We're going to talk about that in number 2. But actually stop seeking it. Girls are raised to view their orientation as being external, right? We're very concerned about what the outside world thinks, actually to the point where it affects our safety. Gavin DeBecker has written this fantastic book called The Gift of Fear, and he talks about the fact that women are socialized to be so pleasing that we override our fear impulses when we are in situations where we should be fearful, and we should react, and we should be rude. So this orientation of being pleasing actually puts us at risk, and that's the extreme. But let's bring it back to what most of us experience. Stop seeking outside validation. Set your own standards and evaluate your own self, and be honest about it. You have the skills, you have the wherewithal to do that. In fact, I would argue you are uniquely situated to determine what success is for you. And that sounds so corny, but you are really uniquely situated because you don't value what the next person values. You probably don't value everything that society values. So set your own markers and then determine whether or not you have achieved them. The second idea, or immunization, if you will, is to learn to internalize external validation. It's still going to come. I think you should approach it differently, right? In the sense that it's not going to be your end-all be-all. But when it comes, embrace it, accept it. It is information. Or as the speaker this morning said, it's data, right? That is somebody telling you something about yourself. Use it. Internalize it. The third is don't suffer in silence. The thing about the imposter syndrome is that it tends to isolate you from your peers. It tends to cause you to be nervous about going and speaking with someone who should be in your network, but you're fearful about it, right? You don't think you're worthy. Goes back to this idea, right, that you've internalized this lack of confidence. The fourth is to laugh. Somewhat at yourself. I mean, we're all kind of funny, right? You're cracking jokes, hopefully, at your expense all the time. Levity keeps you sane. But it's great to laugh at things that have purchase on you, the things that hurt you. There's no better way to rob something of its power than to laugh at it, right? And use laughter as this potent tool. I actually think it's one of the tools that is underutilized in the fight for gender justice. Because I'm sorry, a lot of the sexism, I just can't keep a straight face. It's pretty damn funny. And lastly, look in an accurate mirror. Stop looking in the funhouse mirror, look in an accurate mirror, because then you'll know where you need to go, right? Put together a list of your special skills and qualities. And in fact, I want you to look at that list that you've created, right? Look at your 5. And I know this is hokey, but bear with me. I want you to turn to the person next to you. They don't have to see the list, and maybe it's in your brain and you can just tap your noggin, right? And say, I did this, I worked hard for it, and I deserve the credit for my work. So you just turn to your neighbor. I did this, I worked hard for this, and I deserve the credit for the work. lot of y'all are saying more than that, which is fine. Are you bragging? Yes, okay, give yourselves a hand if you are bragging. Good. And I'll end on one last thought, that at the societal level, so dealing with the imposter syndrome is dealing with the symptom. We need to deal with the root cause, which is that women are considered denied expert status. They're not considered legitimate possessors of knowledge by men or women. So we really need to treat the heart of the problem. That's a longer-term goal that a lot of us are already involved with, but we need a paradigm shift from not valuing women as full human beings to valuing women as full human beings. And I think it's important to keep in mind, again, that there's nothing natural or neutral about gender, right? Masculinity and femininity are the ways in which we identify and evaluate one another. I love this example, right? Going back to the Founding Fathers, just think about how masculinity changes over time. Your Founding Fathers, our Founding Fathers, were wearing knee-highs, they were wearing heels, they were wearing pancake makeup, they were wearing wigs. The mode of masculinity, and they were the pinnacle, right, of society. In the early states, they were the pinnacle. Now just think of John Travolta in the 70s and his mode of masculinity, right? A little staying alive. It wouldn't fly today. Why? Because masculinity and femininity are malleable things. They shift constantly. They shift by culture. They shift by socioeconomic status. They shift by region. There is nothing natural or neutral about masculinity or femininity. So we need to stop creating a masculinity that rejects everything that is feminine. I would also argue, though, it's not enough to simply value the feminine. There are many great things about what I would call stereotypical femininity. The idea of caring, nurturing, loving, being communicative. These are human values which I wish as a culture we embraced more instead of devaluing. But I think it's not enough to just value femininity, because we're also asked to value a lot of very distracting things and that are pretty harmful for us, right? So our inordinate attention on dress and appearance. So we need to move beyond just valuing the feminine. We need a paradigm shift. We need a national conversation about the social constructions and harms of gender roles, and then we need to have a dialogue and choose some basic human values which we can all decide this is what we want to be, and stop imparting false gendering on our children because it harms both girls and boys. And I want to make a pitch for Jennifer Siebel-Newsom's new film that'll be out next year, The Mask We Live In, which does for boys what misrepresentation did for girls. And then one last thought. In terms of the imposter syndrome and striving for perfection, one of the lies that we learned as kids is that there are always adults in charge who know what they're doing, right? Now, a lot of us know by this point that was a big lie. A more accurate assessment, right, is that every endeavor is a human endeavor. Behind every sleek corporation and professional government operation, there's a collection of flawed human beings with imperfect information and often self-serving motivations. So for me, frankly, our scientific, technological, and other human advances are miraculous given our persistent human failings. We're going through our daily lives, and I think it really helps to keep in mind that we're all kind of making it up as we go along at some level. So this idea of an imposter syndrome really doesn't make sense within that context. And I'll end with that. Thank you very much. There's one on the front row. Thank you. Yeah, there's a cat in that slide. Yeah. I actually don't give presentations without at least one cat in the slide, in a slide. You can borrow that if you want. Any questions?
Okay, so, it's working now. Okay, so my question is, with all of your talk about the gaps in men and women, what are your thoughts right now on the younger generation and what's going on with the anti-feminism movement? I am not a feminist. I don't need feminists because I love men. That kind of stuff.
So it's interesting, that's certainly happening right now on social media. We have seen that same language since the 1960s. It is fascinating how many women have benefited from feminism. Is the idea, right, that women and men should experience the same social, political, and economic benefits. It's equality across those three domains, so it's obviously not about hating men. I was just on a panel with someone who told me that feminists hate men, and I had a really big chuckle, laughter. And then I breathed deeply and responded, that's actually not what feminism is about, but it is fascinating to me that what I like to call the backlash machine, which is a cabal of men's rights organizations, MRAs, some religious organizations, conservative organizations, mostly overlap, the conservative right, has promoted that lie. And I think it's sad that it's so effective, but I also think that social media, the pushback against those memes and social media it reflects the fact that the backlash can no longer go unchallenged. And we were talking earlier at a table about the anti-rape movement. The difference between the anti-rape movement, in 1985, like Mary Costas data comes out, we had data that 50 years of data that campus sexual assault is an epidemic. In 1985, that was released.